this question of the challenge to liberal democracy. There's how Fukuyama saw it. And there's also kind of a way in which this ties into the rise of the quote unquote far right, especially in Europe and Trumpism. It's largely, undeniably, a democratic movement. That's a hard pill for people to swallow.
Oh, it absolutely is, though. It's populism.
And that's what's different from fascism. So like with Mussolini was driven by youth, which was allowed power by the ruling class at a particular point where they felt the system was unstable. Mussolini didn't have the kind of popular support that the far right, quote unquote, has today. This idea that this is fascism. Okay. Well, Meloni gets elected on a majority, Viktor Orban gets elected on a majority, and all these and France was supposed to be elected, but the liberals and leftists teamed up to basically defeat what was going to be a victory for the far right, with the working class voting largely for Le Pen, interestingly enough. At some point, you got to question, what is this actually about? Nations determining their own border policy, their own economic policy, is somehow anti-democracy. Well, who is actually against democracy? When the working class in almost every country is voting for right-wing parties, you got to think, is it just that everyone's brainwashed?
It ties back to what you're talking about with the immigration question and kind of the differing views on that. Peter Turchin's work, you can look, so his study of America, Ages of Discord, you can look at the trends and see very clearly that when, immigration is directly tied to, social instability and rates of immigration. And when is the next time when we cut off immigration, stringently cut it off, is 1920s immigration acts, 1921 and 1924. But one of the things you could say is that a lagging trend that came from clamping down on immigration was you massively increased the negotiating power of the workers by stopping a labor oversupply.
Right. And I mean, that was interesting to see that moment, right? When there was the proposal of the foreign work visas. And Bernie and Bannon agreed to oppose it. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, very more neoliberal corporatist types, supported it. That's interesting right there, right? And Bernie gets flack from parts of the confused left for being how he is on immigration, but what he just is that he's just a traditional, that's what a traditional socialist pro-worker position was. You have better bargaining power if you don't have to compete to work with people who literally cannot organize. That's illegal immigrants cannot organize. I heard once some clueless leftist say, "Oh, but you can organize with illegal immigrants."
Right.
How? They're already committing a crime by being there.
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world, and that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish, and because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
If you want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I'm here with Keegan from EssentialSalts, somebody who's been on the podcast before, and I've also been on his show. It was a very good, both of those episodes were very good. I mean, they do very well whenever we collaborate. And it's always fun talking to you because you're one of these, I would say, also idiosyncratic thinkers who's not super ideologically bounded in one area, a real free thinker. And we're here to tackle something that is very much related to stuff you cover, but I think it's also very related to what I cover, and it is one of the most misunderstood texts ever. Misunderstood just solely due to not being read and solely being heard, and that is Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. This is, I think you should at least read the article, but I actually think the article does not capture very well what he says in the overall book, which is massive. It's a much longer book than the article. It's about so much more. There's so much depth to this. And this had been on my reading list for a long time, but it wasn't until about maybe 2 years ago now where I actually read it. And I first got the urge to really read it due to probably, almost over 2 years, where my mentor, one of my intellectual mentors in grad school, who is kind of like a communist or communist sympathizer, he actually wrote an article saying The End of History is a great book, actually. And this was the same mentor who actually put me on to thinkers like Leo Strauss and Alain Badiou. So people who are not really, not just left and right thinkers, people all across the board. And he really made the case that Francis Fukuyama's text, The End of History, and The Last Man, it's like one of the great texts of all time. Like in terms of that period, it's one of the best ever. You don't have to agree with what Fukuyama's politics are, but it's a really compelling text, and I encourage people to read it. In this episode, we're going to be breaking down the book chapter by chapter, but not necessarily summarizing everything. Because first off, I don't recommend summaries. Summaries don't give you a really good picture of the whole thing. You really should read it yourself. But this is going to be sort of a discussion of the various themes in each chapter, just because there's just so much. You can't really just tackle it by his whole argument and then assume you understand it. It's like a whole story. By the end of the book, I was just kind of left pondering about things for months on end, and still. So yeah, I mean, before we get started on the themes of the first chapter, Keegan, would you like to add anything about yourself, and also what made you read this book?
Yeah, I would say that what I really appreciate about Fukuyama's book is that he does raise a series of very interesting questions that were already very sort of important questions to me concerning whether or not there's a possibility of a universal history, treating history in a way that isn't just, there's that quote that I actually first encountered in Peter Turchin's work from Toynbee, who said, history is just one damn thing after another, which is the way that, unfortunately, I think many people tend to engage with history, that it's just sort of a record of or a series of dates of events happening and figures who came along. And there's like a real aversion, I think, to constellating some sort of logic of development to history. And it's a project that I very much have a complex relationship with as a Nietzschean, because in the case of Nietzsche, there is a logic of development in his work. There's also a cyclical element to the way that he views history. So you could draw either one of those sort of conclusions depending on which parts of Nietzsche's philosophy you read and which implications you draw. For my part, when I first encountered this book, it was actually, I had just read Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And a lot of people have presented Fukuyama's work as these two are sort of like counterpoints to one another. And so that was many, many years ago. But in recent years, and especially having just revisited the book in preparation for speaking with you, I'm probably more compelled by Fukuyama, in spite of not agreeing with him on many, many of his central ideas. But I think there is, and I'm sure we'll get into this, there's a way in which Fukuyama is incredibly, I would say, just dead on the nose correct about the zeitgeist of modern liberalism in many ways. So that's what I would say about my engagement with this book.
Yeah, I mean, you cover Nietzsche a lot on your channel. It's why you run the Nietzsche podcast, as it's called. And really, and Nietzsche is sort of the antagonist, I would say, of this book. Not so much like he's trying to bash Nietzsche, but rather that in terms of the history or theory, Fukuyama's theory of history, you could look at Hegel as the protagonist, the one who really articulates this universal theory of history, this progressive theory of history, which, as he talks about, has its foundations before Hegel, but Hegel ultimately develops this concrete framework that Fukuyama takes. Nietzsche is sort of the guy who critiques modernity, one of the most powerful critics of modernity, that really highlights some of the forces in humanity that are antagonists to this broader universal trend that Fukuyama thinks is likely irreversible. That's the hypothesis. But, he recognizes that there's challenges to it, and some of those are brought by Nietzsche. What'll surprise many people who read this book for the first time is truly how well read Fukuyama is on world history and on thinkers. Like, there's this kind of arrogance among a lot of people who read Marx, for example, to think that anyone who isn't a Marxist hasn't read him. I mean, Fukuyama very much does, and he in many ways adopts a similar theory of history to Marx, except without just the kind of materialist analysis. You could look at Fukuyama's theory of history as neither idealist or materialist. That's the kind of interesting thing about it. He very much recognizes the material foundations as to why history goes the way it does, like this whole emphasis on scientific development. But he's also very much, there's all this other stuff about human nature that he emphasizes, like megalothymia, isothymia, this broader discussion of thymos, which honestly, I think the biggest thing that I found Marxists don't analyze is just human behavior and these sort of like things that you can't necessarily measure in a very concrete way.
Yeah, it's a return to Hegel. I mean, in some ways, you could say he develops his argument along the normal material lines, sort of in the beginning, but then he turns towards Hegel and the theory of recognition. And so it's almost both idealist and materialist, and the object of history, or the state at the end of history, is not communist, but capitalist.
Yeah, that's what's the interesting thing. Like, he does have this teleological view of history, and he defends the idea of a universal teleological view of history. While the thing is that unlike Marx, who thought, so maybe to summarize this real quick, basically Hegel viewed history as the playing out of contradictions, and a big part of that's Christianity. We can get into why that is. Christianity is the foundation of universal history in some ways, is a big part of setting that. But basically Hegel saw history as, and really reality itself as made up by constant contradiction. History and the unfolding of regimes is marked by regimes trying to handle various contradictions. The regime that will ultimately triumph is the one that can really handle and contain these contradictions. With Hegel, there's and it's also, I just realized how hard it is to explain Hegel, because then we have to explain isothymia, we have to explain the struggle for recognition, the master-slave dialectic. So maybe actually let's put a bookmark on that. But the point is, Hegel, universal theory of history, but he thinks that the end state would be some kind of liberal state, right? Like a liberal, powerful state. He claimed the Prussian state was close to this. Marx flips this and thinks that capitalism brings in a contradiction between classes that is, you cannot pacify it, and it will lead to a revolution and eventually communism. Fukuyama thinks that this theory of history, right, like there is a logic. It's not just around one damn thing after another. It's not just contingencies. It's not just cyclical, which was prior to the teleological view, the kind of dominant way a lot of historians thought about history, like Thucydides or Ibn Khaldun, who we both really like. He saw it as different like that. But for the end goals, for Marx, Hegel, different. Fukuyama thinks it is liberal democracy. And the first half of the book, because it's broken up into 4 parts, really is demonstrating why liberal democracy triumphed and you know, over the other regime types. The second half, this is how we're going to kind of break down the discussion so listeners know, is all about the threats to liberal democracy and really which bring in the foundations of Fukuyama's theory of like the human urges as to why we do what we do. No, this is where we'll bring in Nietzsche and Hegel more deeply. And I think it's a good way to structure it too, because the book is like, I would say, accessible for most people interested in politics to read, at least the first two parts. The second two parts are for the philosophy enthusiasts, the political philosophy enthusiasts especially, because that's like where I think, it gets like abstract, but more profound in my opinion, in terms of like what it really makes you think about.
Yeah, and I just want to make a quick point about why he thinks liberal democracy is the state at the end of history in the Hegelian sense, and why it's so important that it is a return to Hegel and not a Marxist dialectic. And actually, if I could just like read a quick quote from, I believe it's the 4th chapter, The Worldwide Liberal Revolution, where he says, quote, "Today we have trouble imagining a world that is radically better than our own, or a future that is not essentially democratic and capitalist. Within that framework, of course, many things could be improved. We could house the homeless, guarantee opportunity for minorities and women, improve competitiveness, and create new jobs. We can also imagine future worlds that are significantly worse than what we know now, in which national, racial, or religious intolerance makes a comeback, or in which we are not overwhelmed by war or environmental collapse. In which we are overwhelmed by war and environmental collapse. But we cannot picture to ourselves a world that is essentially better from the present one, and at the same time, essentially different from the present one, and at the same time better. Other, less reflective ages also thought of themselves as the best, but we had to arrive at this conclusion, exhausted, as it were, from the pursuit of alternatives we felt had to be better than liberal democracy," end quote. And so, essentially what he's saying there is, I think, a very salient point, and it's the central point on which I think Fukuyama has the best argument. That when most people articulate a better version of society as it exists now, what they're articulating is a better version of liberalism that more completely realizes the ideals laid down by liberal democracy, which Fukuyama sees, I think rightly, as in this tradition going from Hegel through Kant all the way to the beginnings of the Enlightenment. And I think that is very much true, to the extent that when we see these competing challenges from the left and right, the illiberal left and right, the ideas they're articulating are from the past, like communism and fascism. They're ideas that, he says, we've exhausted ourselves trying these other ideas, these other ideals for how society should be organized. And even the sort of stereotypical like Star Trek future, you can imagine arriving there through like liberal democracy, in the sense of capitalism just does its job so well. We develop technology where energy is like trivially inexpensive. And then all of a sudden you have these like paradisaical conditions. And so, but does that really break us out of the current mind frame or the current Weltanschauung of liberal democracy? And Fukuyama would say it doesn't, that most of the articulations of the future we get are still within that ideal. And that's why Hegel had said history ended in 1806, because I've revealed to you what the ideal is, the state of universal recognition of everyone. Now we just have to reach that ideal. And I guess if you want to call it a faith, the central faith behind that assertion is that what people want is mutual recognition, which I'm sure we'll get into is the main challenge from Nietzsche and others would be that it is not.
Yeah, with that too, like for Hegel, the abolition of slavery is part of that. Like once you abolish slavery, the fundamental thing that is preventing the struggle, the dialectic of recognition really between master and slave, is something that, we're in the horizon of, I wouldn't say like necessarily overcoming, right? But it's like achieving that recognition, which is the recognition is what characterizes so much of human struggle. Liberalism is a project which Fukuyama, acknowledges aims at kind of containing a lot of the human impulses for equality and for inequality, to be better than others. We'll get into that more after, but I want to address something that, because like I can just imagine a few comments that are from people who didn't listen, because there's a few people that click on the title, which is this question of it being out of date. So like I noticed this when I was watching a lecture just to kind of catch up a little bit on Fukuyama's The End of History Revisited, where he was like saying how his thoughts have changed a little bit. And the first comment was like, "Oh, this aged poorly." And I'm thinking, did it? Because like this is the important thing. People look at the rise of the far right today as evidence that Fukuyama was wrong. But Fukuyama, in The End of History, predicts that the main challenge to liberal democracy will come from the right, not the left. They'll come from the right. And the other thing is that Fukuyama, this was a kind of widely publicized event where Fukuyama said, we need socialism to come back, right? That was taken kind of out of context. It was interviewed with Novara Media, I believe. And what he really was saying is that, we need social democracy and you need socialism as sort of antagonist to capitalism so that we can get a compromise like social democracy, which Fukuyama sees as within the limits of liberal democracy itself, and which in the book already he says we can imagine, doesn't mean nothing will change in the end of history. We can still go for more equal distribution, more social democratic policies, or more conservative policies. But at the end of the day, it's going to be liberal democracy for those once they achieve it. He back then had a kind of more neoconservative perspective, which is basically, for those who don't know, neoliberal perspective, but belief in the emphasis on some conservative values as necessary for liberalism to actually work, and also this belief in spreading liberalism abroad, which is where you get the kind of Warhawk element in neoconservatism. He's not really explicit about like war in this, but he does take the neoconservative view, which liberal democracy is not just something that's inherent, the best form of government for like Western people or for Christian people. He really thinks it is a universal ideal. And part of that might lead us neatly into the first chapter on our pessimism. But if you have anything you want to add before that, go ahead.
Oh, just briefly, I would say that as a neoconservative, he seems to take less of a tack that we need to, it's not the Ann Coulter bomb their country, take their oil, and convert them to Christianity. It's more of that old adage that, I forget who said it, like 2 countries that have McDonald's are going to be less likely to go to war. He really very much believes that part of his whole thesis is that warfare in the traditional sense of like ambitious empires trying to claim land and directly administer resources and people is sort of a thing of the past. That governments increasingly realize that they can mutually increase their own wealth and the wealth of another nation through economic relationships. And again, if you're a Marxist or a socialist, I can understand why people would have a problem with that. But within his own perspective, it's actually perfectly sensible to think that like it is a consistent, coherent worldview that he's promoting. That doesn't, I would say, not only does it not incline in favor of being a war hawk, he also holds to the theory that democracies are less likely to attack other democracies. Sort of a challenge to the classical realist mode of thinking. But again, I'm sure we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, and just so people know, neither of us are saying like Fukuyama was right about everything or that we agree with him on everything. Because it might seem that way as we're presenting his arguments, because I really think the better way to like present arguments is just to present them before the critique and critique after. Because if you just present it with the critique, you kind of distort the people's understanding of it. But maybe to foreshadow one of my critiques that we can save later is like Fukuyama did underestimate certain things and didn't predict certain things. And I would say a big part of that is underestimation of the forces of nationalism and, unfortunately, a dark kind of force, race. I think these are 2 things that he underestimated heavily that would play huge challenges to liberal democracy. And these are things which leftists very much also underestimate. which is why I think it's not a coincidence that despite a declining liberal center, you do not see the rise of a left. You see the rise of the right almost everywhere, right? So to the first chapter now, I think a good way to get into this is the first chapter is called Our Pessimism, and the central claim is basically him showing how his hypothesis and thesis was not something that everyone thought. It wasn't like it was in line with the zeitgeist, but it was not in any way the common opinion, even majority opinion among like liberal foreign policy establishment. He thinks that he talks about how for a long time, liberals included, were actually very pessimistic about the limits to liberal democracy and thought that, well, the Soviet Union's here to stay. You know, like he brings up the realists and Henry Kissinger and how they basically accepted that the Soviet bloc, you can't defeat it. We might as well just carve up our spheres of influence and just coexist peacefully.
Yeah, he says Kissinger he quotes Kissinger as saying that Soviet communism will be an unending challenge to liberalism.
Yeah.
Which, and you know, he is writing right on the cusp of the breakup of the Soviet Union, but many of the things that he predicts over the coming decades do come true to a large extent. But again, we could get into the predictive power of the work later, I guess. But yeah, he contrasts the optimism in which democracy was birthed as an ideal, the 18th century, 19th century, with the stark pessimism that comes after World War II, and basically thinks that this is all of these catastrophes of modern society have sort of poisoned our hopes for the future. That because it seems so, I guess, you know, just spontaneous and chaotic and like you might say like insane. Why would a force such as fascism arise right when we're on the cusp of making everyone's lives better with new technology and the democratization of Europe? Is there a yearning inside mankind for these that will manifest in the form of nationalist movements or romantic militarism, things like that? And as you point out, there were many people who believed that then, and there are also many people who believe that today. I mean, I would say it's one of the things that people most often bring up in response to the end of history is that he didn't predict, or that, again, it comes from not carefully reading the book or not reading it at all, because as you say, he does bring up, he actually gets in the later chapters very deeply into nationalism. And yeah, but I would say it's by no means was the accepted opinion then. And I don't know if it ever was, really. I don't know if Fukuyama, I feel like he has been kind of lambasted from the beginning. There's always been naysayers. But I think he's more or less, he's onto something still with the idea that they're going to continue to legitimize themselves through the language of democracy, even nationalist regimes.
Well, in some ways, his view did have a faction for it. It just wasn't like a consensus by any means. And a good way to look at that is sort of the difference between the neoconservatives and the realists. So, like, as we mentioned, Kissinger is a realist, and his school of foreign policy saw, you know, certain, not just like the Soviet bloc is here to stay and that you have to just carve up influence. He thought that the only way to defeat communism from spreading into the American sphere of influence was propping up right-wing dictatorships. So this is a big reason why the U.S. allowed for all kind of right-wing dictatorships in the case of, well, you know, Pinochet is Guatemala, Nicaragua when failed, got overthrown, but or the Shah of Iran,
Saddam
Hussein before they turned on him, right? And then they also allowed Franco to exist. They allowed Salazar to exist. These two dictatorships fell, well, in the case of Portugal, more fell on its own. And in Spain, the king kind of just made it, gave the power to the parliament. But it was the U.S. policy for a while to just think, okay, well, you know, liberal democracy is not necessarily something we want to spread. The neocons were a little bit odd and unique. we just have this image today of neocons being more Warhawk-like, but it's more so the difference between neocons at the time and realists, where they both were for American imperialism. They both had this interest of America at heart. The difference is the neocons had this belief in the universality of liberal democracy. And you could say it's debatable to what extent neoconservative politicians really embodied this ideology as opposed to using it as a justification for war, right? With like Bush and whatnot, or Tony Blair, right? Very much use this sort of rhetoric. But a good example of this is of a non-technically, it's not necessarily a good example of this neoconservative worldview triumphing a little bit was Reagan. So with Reagan, unlike like Nixon, who tried to do détente and do peace with the Soviet Union and whatnot, the bloc that ended up getting Reagan elected in his foreign policy establishment saw the Soviet Union as a paper tiger. And that if you just actually pressed it a little more and you encouraged the people to rebel, these regimes would crumble. Because ultimately people have a desire for democracy and freedom. Whereas you could look at the realists had the view of, Kevin Spacey in the Call of Duty clip that people love to make viral, democracy. People don't want democracy. They want order, blah, 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 blah. They didn't take that view. They took the view that, no, this is something like, no, they can do, Eastern Europe can do democracy as well. And when I say democracy, I mean in the limited liberal democratic sense, but it's still, nonetheless, I think most people would agree, more democratic than the one-party state regimes that existed in the East. Reagan's famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The Eastern Europeans want freedom. That was kind of that policy, and marked with the arms race and all of that in a lot of propaganda. That kind of encouraged people in the East to actually be like, okay, I'm not saying that's why it happened, but it did play a role in like not accepting these states as like just here to stay. It was to kind of actually be like, let's topple. Whether you think that's good or bad, that's a whole other question. But the point is that is the difference in the foreign policy. And Fukuyama at the time probably would have leaned more like that. But his thing was just that he believed in the fact, for him it's a fact, that it just was the superior regime. He didn't believe the idea that only Western people could do liberal democracy, only one kind of race could do it. He thought that anyone could do it, but with the right conditions. And he believed there's this whole set of conditions that are necessary for liberal democracy, such as economic development, such as a certain degree of social trust, social capital, or aka pre-liberal values that can make people stick together. But we'll get to all that. Any thoughts that I've kind of missed or things to add to this whole part?
Yeah. Just two things is like, I think on this difference between the realists and the neocons, I think one of the key things too is also the notion that within a realist geopolitics, if you have two empires or states that are competing for resources, hegemony, whatever the case might be, it kind of doesn't matter what their form of government is. You would assume that they're going to, you'll still have the Thucydides trap between two great powers, even if they're both ostensibly democratic. Whereas I think the neocons believe that there is actually, by spreading those values, you will reduce warfare. Like, we might have to do some warfare and conflict now to spread democracy and freedom throughout the globe, but in the long run, it will create, this neoliberal order where we can all sort of trade. The other thing I would just say, and I think this will be clarifying to the audience, I think throughout when we're using these terms like democracy, liberalism, we're using them the way that Fukuyama understands them. I personally am a critic of the idea of democracy in the sense that I don't think that it really exists in the way that we think that it does. But when I'm invoking democracy here, I'm invoking his conception of it, which is very nuanced, and he admits a lot of the flaws with democracy. But he thinks that actually formally whether or not it's more or less democratic, it's actually very important that it be formally democratic, because those in the long run will produce better outcomes of being actually democratic. Even if you can find some outliers of systems that aren't called democracy by name, but are, functionally more democratic than someone who does call themselves a democracy. And that's the other thing about this book, is that Fukuyama is clearly writing to people who are bought into the liberal project, along with himself. That's his
But a lot
audience.
of
That
leftists.
this.
A lot of leftists.
Well, sure. Well, I guess what I'm saying is he takes it for granted that you're on the side of democracy and not on the side of the illiberal right or the illiberal left. That's his audience, so to speak. So many people will criticize Fukuyama from just saying
he also doesn't consider like democracy being more than just, parliamentary conflict resolutions.
Right. I think he would. That's another thing that maybe, to the extent the work is a product of its time, he wasn't responding to people with Greek statues in their PFP who think that it would be better if we were ruled as a kind of like just a brutal aristocracy of old. He basically takes it for granted that we're all past that. We all think it would be better if we weren't under authoritarian rule. What's the best ideal for transcending that? And so I think it's just important to keep that in mind as we're reading this text as well, that he doesn't really, he does provide arguments for the superiority of liberal democracy, but not on the level of values in the Nietzschean sense. Perhaps he even gets into that a little bit at the end, but I don't think he's trying to argue with someone who would be convinced we need monarchy. I'll just put it like that. He's mostly taking it for granted that we all sort of want what's best for the human race in terms of our freedom and flourishing.
So he does take it for granted, but he takes that for granted because for him, he really does believe it's an objective fact that it's a superior form. And he gets into that in the second two next chapters called The Weakness of Strong States, part 1 and 2. And also in the one after called The Worldwide Liberal Revolution.
Yeah, so in The Weakness of Strong States, I mean, there's a part 1 and a part 2, which really have to do with I guess you could say, the legitimacy of the regimes, of the leaders of those regimes. And then just the fact that their ideas, he says that no dictatorship actually rules by force. There's always some level of ideology behind it to some extent. But that those ideas they've basically been proven to be inferior to liberal democracy when it comes to, say, managing economic and social concerns. When it comes down to the practical matters of running a society, he gives many, many examples of right authoritarian dictatorships collapsing, but that's one of the main drivers of it. And then the other part of that, and the part 2 of The Weakness of Strong States, is effectively that we have this notion, I guess, that an authoritarian state can just force people to believe whatever they want to believe, that perhaps if you've internalized the pessimism of 1984 or something like that, that a state can sort of exist in this post-truth ecosystem where they can just lie to the people and say everything's working out great even though it isn't. And his counter to that is the Soviet Union, that they actually were unable to do so. He has a great line where he says that it turned out that the average Russian's ability to think for themselves had actually not been uprooted even after decades and decades of Soviet communism. That, in the words of Adam Curtis in Hypernormalization, they could see with their own eyes in the grocery store with empty shelves that the centrally planned economy was not being managed effectively. And eventually the dam breaks. And they're just sort of like again, I don't know, you could call it a faith, you could call it unduly optimistic, but he's basically looking at, in recent history, the fact that a number of regimes not only fell from power, but in many cases willingly gave it up, acknowledging that democracy would be a better alternative. And that there's just sort of this almost inexorable movement in that direction. Again, it's very helpful to think of this from Fukuyama's perspective as someone who does believe in the superior of the liberal democratic capitalist system, because he thinks, obviously, if you look at the results, it's just going to produce better results. And it's not going to actually be possible to just brainwash everyone into seeing that that it doesn't produce better results. And so, yeah, the question. Oh, and the part 2 is called "Eating Pineapples on the Moon," and he begins by quoting from someone writing in the 60s about the 1960s about the future of Soviet communism, and how we'll have already gone to the moon. We'll be figuring out how to grow, do horticulture and agriculture on the moon by this time. And he imagines this by the 1980s, and how that's just like a complete falsification, or not even falsification. It's just completely inaccurate as to the course of the Soviet Union. But then the author he's citing says, we've been eating pineapples on the moon for quite a while now. Basically, the people are able to recognize that the state is not delivering on its promises.
Yeah, that's a great point, because Fukuyama recognizes that it's not like the Soviet regimes had no success at all, right? And frequently, if you hear Marxist Leninists who try to counter propaganda, they will say, well, look at all the industrialization that the Soviet Union achieved, that China achieved, even though most of its successes have been embracing the capitalist market. But with the Soviet Union, no doubt, I mean, it wasn't as big of a backwater as a lot of Marxist Leninists make it out to be. I mean, culturally, certainly wasn't. And it was for European standards, definitely like the sick man of Europe. And was able to industrialize through sheer force and brutality. But nonetheless, it brought a country. I think after China, the fastest growing economy was the Soviet Union. And it was a very fast development, no doubt. So he says that the Soviet regimes had a strength in this rapid industrialization. And there was a brief period where there was even a fear among the liberal West that this type of regime might actually outperform the West. And, you had this with this decade of humiliation, do they call it? Which was when the Soviets got to space first, right? There was this huge fear, and that's a big reason why the United States started, taking education way more seriously, taking its internal problems way more seriously. I think this actually is kind of a little bit underplayed by Fukuyama, which is the role in which the Soviet Union did challenge the United States in particular to be a lot better, and especially on like race relations, because a big part of that was decolonization, which the Soviet Union helped foster in Africa, a little bit opportunistically, you might say, but still did nonetheless. And that threatened that, when you have that happening, that's going to encourage Black people in America, if they don't have the right freedoms, to engage in all sort of radical activity, as it did. So, you did have.
Yeah, well, and he does kind of address that a little bit, where he's bringing up one of the objections of the realists that perhaps a bipolar or multipolar world could perhaps have a net positive benefit, that tension. So he does kind of bring that up, but I don't know if if he satisfactorily answers it as regards that specific example of the Soviet Union and the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's one theme with Fukuyama. It's that some of the successes of liberal democracy, I think, were made possible by a lot of movements and struggles, which sometimes get underplayed when it comes to that forcing liberal democracy to be better. But what he would say, which I think would be a valid counter, is that, well, that was allowed because in a liberal democracy, you do have the right to protest, and you have the environment where ideas like, racial equality and stuff, you can have all these discussions at a freer level than you could in a repressive regime where you can't criticize the government. His point with industrialization is that while the Soviet regimes were really good at rapid industrialization, what they failed to do is adapt in the information age, because this sort of closed system that was bent on restricting information, preventing who can leave and enter the country at a very rigid rate. I mean, if people think Trump's border policy is crazy, the Soviet Union, that was crazy border policy for who could come in and who could leave. You had to get full approval just to leave the country. It was totally controlled. And this sort of system where you have a controlled information environment, and you have a leadership which is very secretive, not just among the public, but even amongst itself, right, within its own factions. That's why you had a lot of the leaders like kind of come and go through like coups, soft coups, like in the case of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and then the power struggle between all the three guys who died in a row, and then Gorbachev after. It was a system that was not good ultimately at adapting to the internet. Well, I was going to say information age, but the internet. So the Soviet Union had every infrastructure it needed to create the internet. It had very skilled engineers. It had state capacity. Yeah, why didn't it create the internet? This is a thing a lot of people have analyzed. A big part of that was that, well, they did have a program to build the internet, and they curtailed it. And that was largely because they were afraid of the idea of transparent information was a total threat to them. You know, they really say what you want about Gorbachev, right? Like Gorbachev accelerated the transition to liberal democracy way too fast. You know, that's a totally fair argument. I think that's obviously true. But given how that went, but like the fact of the matter is the Soviet Union was just not the reason why you had Gorbachev in the first place and Deng Xiaoping before him, a decade before him, is because the shit wasn't working. Everyone was realizing that like they were just getting outcompeted, while the Soviet Union was very like neck and neck with the U.S. You know, up until like you could say the late '60s. By the '70s, you start to have stagnation as we transition to an economy more bent on consumption. Soviet Union could not compete at the level of consumption, and it tried to on its own standards. It really did. I mean, what was the promise? Is that you would have more abundance. It was that it would be more abundant than capitalism, and the propaganda was often depicting like pictures from the Great Depression as if that was still happening in the U.S. by the 1980s. It wasn't. By the 1980s, people had access to stuff in the Soviet Union you had to wait in line for a very long time, like refrigerators, cars, jeans, a lot of the stuff we take for granted, right? So Fukuyama's point is because this lack of restriction of information and also the failure of central planning, which this planned economy was not only just ideological, it was also in tandem with the regime type. The reason why these tight regimes prefer central planning is not just because they have an ideological commitment against the inequalities of capitalism. It's because of the fragility of the elite. When you have capitalism, you now have a competition of elites. And as Fukuyama, what I think is a good thing that he recognizes, other than the general kind of neoconservative critics, sometimes the neoconservative ideologists will like to say democracy is just they'll talk of democracy in the propagandistic sense of what it is, which is ruled by the people. I like that Fukuyama admits that democracy arises as a conflict resolution between elites. When you have competing elites and they can settle being like, okay, well, maybe we'll just compete in parliament and settle it out.
Yeah, not only that, but it's interesting. This is again to skip ahead to a later chapter, but where he says that because of the ways in which in political life you sometimes have to degrade yourself and you have to appeal to voters who might be informed or not informed. They might be intelligent or they might be stupid. You might have to say things you don't believe, and you're ultimately just the first among equals, the prime minister or something like that. He says it's actually a really positive development that people will express their concept we'll get into later, megalothymia. They'll express this desire to be superior in the realm of business instead. And the elites will sort of, again, have this other outlet that will be far, far more productive than, because he recognizes how in a political sense, that competition between elites can really quickly turn into a race towards who can become like the tyrant or something like that. And it's actually to our benefit that we've made the politicians less powerful than an economic elite, which is funny. But yeah, he says, I believe, about the communist regimes, they were really great at advancing their economies to roughly where liberal democracies were in 1950, perhaps far more rapidly, but then they can't really get beyond that to a post-liberal or a post-industrial age. For all the reasons that you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, you could look at liberal democracy as a sort of game, right? That can kind of sublimate a lot of the human urges that cause instability. And this is where I think Fukuyama's most counterintuitive point is made. That is probably one of the most powerful points in the weaknesses of strong states. Well, why the idea of a strong state being weak is itself counterintuitive. I mean, you look at the way a lot of people think of politics. You see the conflicts that happen between Democrats and Republicans. It always seems like stuff is unstable, but it never there's never topples, right? In England, you have crazy sensationalist headlines about the prime minister. You have collapse of government, yet society continues. France, you have collapse of government all the time. Society continues. You have one election after the other. There's a strength in this, which is that when there's a crisis of legitimacy, you have another election and you elect it. Because if you elected us, you'd say, they're the government. People elected you. Well, they can't really complain about your rule not being justified. And that's the power. I talked about this in an older video some listeners might remember called the two-party simulation. I talk about it a lot in my work in general, this question of legitimacy, which is why do people rule you?
But Studebaker also.
Oh, yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the podcast.
That's like his thing. But he also, one of the advantages of an election is that it's like he talks about the fact that China's a one-party state. It's actually a great example. That's like a weakness for their legitimacy, for precisely the reason that you can't. It's not just that the responsibility kind of redounds to you, the people, for having voted for me, but it's also we can go cycle through to the next party and the responsibility can be diffused. It's not, you don't have like this constantly pent up anger that kind of can't go anywhere because you know that the same party is still in power. Whereas even if you think that's illusory within liberal democracies, the fact that people are able to basically voice that anger and then feel like something's been done when somebody, there's like a gubernatorial recall and somebody's been kicked out, that diffuses the like what might otherwise be a worsening crisis of legitimacy. And so that's another way in which, it's another weakness of strong states.
Yeah, because like if you hate the government, okay, maybe the next time you'll get your shot, right? And you could say it's all a conspiracy, it's all a game to like keep the people controlled. But point is it really does work in a sense of containing what conflicts that could really get out of control. And an example of that is if you rule through force, right? Because if you don't allow people to really express themselves, to ultimately express what they view and allow them to, ultimately get out their struggle to be recognized, it'll reach, the only thing you're really suppressing them with is a threat to violence. Now, that threat of violence is held together by a military and repressive apparatus that believes in the authority of the ruling party. That's legitimacy, which is why he says no one really rules with pure force. In that, for example, like the fascist dictatorships believed in the ultimate authority of their leaders as part of their legitimacy, or a lot of the kind of more, you could say, moderate right-wing dictatorships like Salazar or Pinochet, or in Argentina and Brazil, they came to power on the premise of bringing stability, right? That was their whole promise. Is like, okay, there's chaos, we'll bring order. Now, when that need is like no longer there to bring this urgent stability, their purpose kind of goes away. Like it's like, why are you still ruling over us, right? They don't really have a mantle to legitimacy, because keep in mind, legitimacy is a powerful thing because it's why do people with guns obey you? That's pretty damn important. Like, why do they follow orders? Ultimately, the only thing stopping a revolt from succeeding is the military being like, I don't want to follow the rules. I'm not going to shoot at the protesters. And that is how a lot of revolutions have happened.
Consider what happened in South Korea a couple months ago, where the military tried to do sort of like an attempted coup, and then the rank and file at the end of the day didn't have enough of a motivation or desire to challenge the legitimacy of the government. More, perhaps they their commanders overestimated how much of a lack of legitimacy there was. And the whole thing fizzles out immediately. But you would think if it's just naked force, like why wouldn't any military in a liberal democracy just decide on, like, hey, we're the guys with like we're the Praetorian Guard in ancient Rome. We can pick the next emperor. Why wouldn't they do that? And it does point to the fact that there's something going on that is mental, that is on the level of consciousness. It's another way in which, like a theory of legitimacy for why states remain stable is a challenge to materialist theories of history in a very subtle way. Because even if it's based on material flourishing or stability or all of these things, and even if you generally need there to be some sort of popular immiseration for revolutions to kick off, even people like I follow Peter Turchin's work very closely. Even in his model, where he says popular immiseration is one of the main drivers, you don't really get revolutions without a counter elite, unless you have a fracturing of the legitimacy into factionalism on the level of the elites, who then establish these rival patronage networks and so on and so forth. You really need to have, it's almost like you need a competing idea of what the legitimacy will be, and then you can rally people to sort of fight behind it. But yeah.
Yeah, and why don't the military just not accept elections? Well, that is a problem in some states, and that's kind of where Fukuyama gets at the separation from the military from politics, because that's the condition in which it works. I mean, a big problem with a lot of Latin American democracies for a while was precisely the military having such a big role in politics, and it deciding to go against elections. And that's why Argentina, for example, had this long battle for like where it had democracy, then didn't, and then it got it back. And you have in countries like Pakistan, for example, or Turkey. These are two examples of countries where the military is the predominant elite, not just politically, but economically, and that gives it huge power in being able to kind of go against elections. It's also integrated with the quote unquote deep state, which the part of government that is not accountable to the electorate. These all serve as obstacles to democracy. Like you can have presidential republics that, as long as the military is kept out of politics and it's divided to a certain extent, there's a separation between its leadership. Like you have the U.S. Navy, you have the Marine Corps, you have various branches that are under different leaderships effectively. And there's an incentive for if one tried to do a coup, the other would overthrow it. We have a different system of like rewarding military than through like economic prestige. It's why we created the badges and honor and all that stuff, because that's like a way to, give prestige without being overt, making them overt elites. The competition of elites is crucial for Fukuyama, because if you don't, the military is the elite, then you have an incentive in the power for the military to go against elections. But even
and just a brief point too of one of the observations he makes when you talk about Latin America and sort of wavering between democracy, because Latin America is an obvious case where it seems as though they're unable to like establish a lasting democratic rule that's consistent in many places. But he says that whenever this happens, there's not usually an ideological challenge to democracy. There'll be a slide into authoritarianism, but it's not based on like articulated principles of now we're going to have a fascist government.
Right.
Now we're going to have a socialist government. Now, I guess in recent years in Latin America, that may have changed in some countries, but that's debatable. I don't know enough about Latin American politics, contemporaneous Latin American politics, to say anything about that. I just know there's been some recent socialist presidents and so on and so forth.
Sure.
Again, you can see that as being within liberal democracy. That's right. Right. I think, they're not exactly Marxist-Leninist regimes that are arising in South America or Central America at the moment. But I think he is largely correct that we don't really see regimes. I mean, it was somebody that Fukuyama couldn't have possibly known about, but who became very important, even in American domestic politics recently, was Bukele. And it's interesting that even he, as this authoritarian strongman, ultimately at the end of the day, his goals are still, he legitimizes himself
Uh-huh.
through liberal speak. He's President Bukele. He's not
Yeah.
Colonel Bukele. And he's also, his whole logic of taking on the gangs was so that the economics of society could get going again. And that he saw the economics of poverty and crime, like those things like linked hand in hand. That as long as people are incentivized to, like, they can have a better economic path forward by joining a gang, then they're going to opt to join the gang. So we have to make it so basically unappealing, the prospects of what could happen to you at the hands of the state if you join a gang, that they'll be forced to get back into the market again, and then that over time will rejuvenate the market. And so it's like none of his goals, I mean, even if his tactics are authoritarian and beyond the pale of what we would consider to be acceptable within modern liberal democracy, again, his goals aren't, we're going to return to a storied era of pagan values, or we're going to have Marxist-Leninism. It's still very much within, I need to do a strongman thing to have a legitimate liberal democracy again. And so that's another one of his really interesting points throughout the text, is that the language of legitimacy is now democratic, regardless of the form of the government.
Yep. When everyone's saying, appealing to democracy as the way in which you legitimize yourself, you know the principle has had a lot of power. But why, even in practice, do you need a form of democracy instead of just, pretending to be democracies? And because, like, of course, I mean, the Nazis and fascist Italy did call themselves democratic, just of a different sort. For Fukuyama, he does think you can have a bunch of obstacles and hiccups on the way to this broader trend to liberal democracy, but that they don't really reverse long-term trend. To address what you were saying about Latin America, I actually think that's a good example in favor of Fukuyama's theory, actually. Because in Latin America, they had a long battle to get to democracy, but really didn't reverse the trend, which is that, if you look at most countries in Latin America, they have, they have like liberal democracies. They just have more corruption than a lot of the Western countries do. And attempts to kind of go beyond it, which is like establish a more, strongman rule. It hasn't worked that well. For example, if you look at like Venezuela, I mean, Hugo Chavez kind of did set the bar for this. He concentrated the power through his popularity that Maduro was able to use. Now, Maduro, due to partially the conditions he inherited of hyperinflation and the really oil-reliant economy of Venezuela, and in addition to his lack of charisma, him lacking popularity plus U.S. sanctions, I mean, it shows you the limits of that kind of form of government, which is, Venezuela has had to basically rig elections to stay in power, and we'll see how long that lasts. The thing about it is we look at Venezuela, it's fragile. It's partially why the U.S. can go poke around there and kind of like provoke Venezuela at the way they do. It's because they're an easy target. A country where there's a strong legitimacy, that's much harder to do. That legitimacy is crucial because, even if, like, let's say, Bukele, for example, the reason why he's able to concentrate power at the rate he is because he's genuinely popular. I mean, he has been elected in what seem to be free and fair elections. He is just genuinely very popular. It is a Caesarist trap, though, right? To like get popular by just and concentrate tons of power by doing things that are popular. The issue is that if you concentrate power to a point where your regime is no longer democratic, like you no longer allow elections, and you don't have that basis of popularity, well, you're basically now only relying on the military and repressive apparatus to obey you and keep people in check through force. And what is going to get people to obey you? Well, Venezuela, I mean, it's bribed its military. Its military is basically its ruling class, kind of becoming very close to what Egypt's like, which is Egypt's a militocracy, which is basically a military hierarchy where the military itself is basically the ruling class or part of it, where it owns a lot of industry, owns a lot of wealth. It's basically like a rich So that can work for a point in time, right? But these are all like temporary things. The genius of the election is that like no matter how unpopular the government gets, you can kind of fix it through an election. So we think that's the hypothesis anyway. But if you look at England, England looks like it's going to explode all the time. Like they talk about the prime minister is so unpopular. Fuck Keir Starmer. That's just every leader England has. They just get torn to bits. But it's just they have an election and it's there you go, right? It keeps moving on. So there's a power in that, and that's why the Soviet Union failed, because the Soviet Union wasn't able to like create a basis of getting legitimacy. And for a long time, right? Like it's what got the Soviet military and the Soviet elites, the bureaucracy to obey it, which included people like Yeltsin, right? You know, Yeltsin's a good example of a counter elite who used to be integrated into the apparatus, but when he realized it's better to be a elite like the West, he was like, oh, I don't really, this system sucks. And yet a lot of the Soviet elite ultimately turned. That's what's interesting. Unlike Eastern Europe, where it was the people who largely turned against the government, like through the mass uprisings of solidarity in Poland or Hungary, and then you had Bulgaria is also a kind of interesting case too, or Albania or East Germany, famously revolt, right? The Soviet Union, while there was a lack of popularity in the government, it was ultimately the counter-elite insurgency that toppled the Soviet Union. And what allowed that to happen? Well, what the biggest thing that was keeping the Soviet elite and the Soviet military to support the regime was a belief in socialism. Over time, this got watered down to mean improving of living standards. When those living standards stopped improving, a lot of people just stopped believing in the system. And that's how you go from like Stalinist dogmatism, where it's like people believe in communism so much to a point where it's like they're willing to like kill people to save the revolution, to a system characterized by the famous slogan, right? Or saying, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. Right?
Yeah, Fukuyama quotes. And I believe I first heard that one from old Jordan Peterson, actually. But yeah.
I actually heard it from a Russian. That's how I heard it. And there was this other Russian saying, which is, capitalism's domination of man over man, socialism is the opposite. Which is just like man over man, right? And like there really was. I mean, think about it like that. While socialism, you might have had like some material comforts, and many of the people who wanted the end of the system in Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, they were kind of imagining that they would be able to like keep access to a lot of these benefits while still having like more democratic society and freedom and market access. Like, they're really envisioning kind of social democracy of sorts. They didn't get that. Most of the places anyway. The fact is that people had to wait in line to get access to stuff that they were told that they were going to get more abundantly than capitalism. When you have that situation, you get a kind of crisis. You really do. And people felt immiserated. It's a kind of, you are a slave to the government in a very literal sense. If you can't leave easily, you basically have to wait in line to get your basic necessities, rations. That is a very dehumanizing form of life. So was at a point when you started having that come back, because there was a period of abundance when this decade of stagnation that sort of was happening. Really, the only people who were believing in the system at a genuine level were the elite, intellectuals, people in the military who, they would join it, because they would become spies for the Soviet Union because, we're going to export the revolution. Ideology really works in having states function because it's like you really believe there's a goal here. When people stop believing in that goal, well, you get more traitors, you get more spies, you get more military who's willing to not shoot the protesters. Then you get ultimately elites, right? Like Yeltsin, who are like, fuck it, I'm going to go defect. And that's how it happened. Like basically the president of the RSFSR, which Yeltsin was, president of Ukraine, and the other republics, except Kazakhstan for some reason, all decided to basically leave. That's how it fell.
Yeah, I was just going to say ideology, I think, is very important for your functionaries. or janissaries. Like the middle, or like to reference 1984 again, the outer elite basically runs on ideology. And I think that's where the loss of the legitimacy of that ideology can be most destructive. Although, I mean, I guess, it does raise the question, I guess the age-old question of, like, does revolution come from the bottom up or the top down? I mean, I think it's both. I think you have to have both sort of working together. I think that, like, you have a certain historical moment forms when you have both the counter-elite and the popular immiseration. But, yeah, I think that's where the ideology is doing the most work. I don't know if ideology necessarily is as necessary for the general public. Again, if you have this legitimizing force like democracy, other than like belief in the legitimacy of democracy, basically. Because the people will have their own competing ideologies. But again, if they can vote out the other guy or feel like, we just need to push liberal democracy in this left direction or in this right direction, that will diffuse a lot of that. But yeah, actually in the chapter 4 on the worldwide liberal revolution, though, something I did want to bring up, which I guess kind of ties in general terms to what we've been talking about, is how he does show that, a lot of this that we've been talking about, I think especially in recent years, some of the arguments that you might hear are counter arguments to Fukuyama would be that perhaps the emergence of democracy is a cyclical thing, or liberalism in general is a cyclical thing. Or, again, I've already sort of brought this up, but perhaps there's a sort of eternal call to nationalist or sort of like ethno-nationalist ideologies that you'll always have to combat. Or, there was Kissinger's view that communism will be an unending challenge. But what's really persuasive in Fukuyama's basically argument for a universal history, for a logic of development in history, is the fact that if we look at the number of countries that are formally speaking democracies now versus the beginning of democracy, it's incredibly clear that it's not just that there are way more democracies now, it's that almost every country legitimizes themselves in these terms today. And in terms of actually existing democracies, representative democracies within liberalism, within capitalism, there are just innumerable examples. And that it doesn't, like, you might be able to chart ups and downs over the history of the democratization of the world, but that it's a graph that kind of would go like this. You might have those ups and downs, but with an overall trend moving in the direction of liberal democracy. And, that, again, the challenge from the Marxist side would be that it has to be sublated further into something else because it doesn't solve all of the problems. Which, I mean, that's, on some level, you have to just accept that Fukuyama's claim that we've arrived at the ideal at the end of history is not something you could verify or falsify. Because, as he says, that's like leaping over roads. It's or to use Hegel's term that the owl of Minerva only flies at midnight, that you have to sort of, you have to be like retrospectively looking at the past in order to understand it. Understanding is sort of trails behind the event. So there's no way that we can really know whether we've actually, like, he's not presenting a scientific hypothesis, I think. That's the other way that I think his work has been unfairly characterized. I think what he is saying is that if we were to look, standing at the point in history that we're at now, and then look at the history of political life and political theory in not just the Western world, but worldwide, you would see, like, the story that you would have standing at this point is the story of democratization and the liberalization of the world. And I think that it's rather difficult to argue against that. Even as a Nietzschean myself, I don't even think Nietzsche would necessarily disagree with him on that point, by the way. But again, there are people who would say, like, that still think within this Aristotelian framework, basically. Which I think does apply, just like a brief into the weeds with Nietzsche's ideas. I think Nietzsche does have a cyclical theory of history as regards on the civilizational level. On, like, the biological level, he does not. And that's maybe not in the biological level in the way people would normally think of it, but he would say in terms of the values that shape and reshape humanity into what we're going to become in the distant future, there is a logic of development. And I don't think he thinks it's by any means inevitable, but maybe the way to put it is like this. History is just this repeating cycle within humanity as it currently exists, unless man himself changes into something else. So like the nature of man himself changes. But nevertheless, I think Nietzsche would agree there is a logic of development in history, that we are steadily embracing these values of egalitarianism, democracy, liberalism, so on and so forth, and that you can just manifestly see this, that there is actually, like with the French Revolution and all of the events that were kicked off in the wake of that, it's not just one damn thing after another. There is something that we are proceeding towards. And again, I can see there are plenty of very valid objections to Fukuyama's outlook on this. But I think you'd be hard pressed to quibble with him on the issue that the world has not become more democratic. That the world has not, that if you looked, again, standing at this point in history and looking back, you could start wherever you want. You could start with the American Revolution. You could start with the foundation of the Greek city-states. Overall, we've become more democratic than we were from any point that you start at. And so, yeah, the challenges to that, I guess, would be, is that an inexorable logic? Or is there some way in which that democracy will just be like an aberration? It's kind of hard to say that when this process has been going on for hundreds of years. But I'll kick it over to you because I've been talking for a while.
No, that was all great. Just hearkening back to something you said about elites and whether revolution comes from the below or the top. I would say that revolution comes from below, not so much below as in the lower class, but it comes from society. So, like, whether that be the bourgeoisie, petite bourgeoisie, working class, peasants, but from society as opposed to the state. But it's not ultimately, it's regime change that happens from the top. Always. Regime change generally always happens from the top. And this is so part of why we don't call liberal democracies regimes is because there's no real need for regime change in this. At least most people don't think there is, because you change the government through an election. Now, some countries are more democratic than others. I have a whole book I've been writing for a long ass time on managed democracy for this reason. There's a spectrum. But nonetheless, most people don't believe regime change is necessary because you just elect a different government. Marxists, Leninists have a hard time dealing with this. They love to point to this Michael Parenti speech where he's like, our governments are called democracies and governments. The foreign governments that are anti-American are called regimes. And that's not why they're called regimes. They're called regimes because a party rules the state. And they're built into it. There isn't like a competition over power in a civil way. It's just, that's why you call it the Kim regime for North Korea. Americans also didn't just apply this label to non-American regimes. Like people would call it the Francoist regime, the Salazar regime. Even though they didn't interfere in a Franco, they called it the Francoist regime, right? Or they'll say Saudi Arabia. You don't even have to call it Saudi regime because the word Saud is just a family. Arabia is the country. Saud just rules. It's a monarchy. It's a regime. The reason why we don't call American Canada regimes is because that would just not make sense. It's you could argue, right? Like I say the most you could say is you could say the Democrats and Republicans are a cartel, not the cartel are a regime, but even this framework is dodgy given how much between those parties it's really open to so much capture of different elites to the point where calling it a regime is more of a distortion than something that really accurately understands it. It's not a question of good or bad. That's the thing. People really focus on the propagandistic element of all this. But that's important because if you have a regime then you need regime change to change the government. If you have an election, you don't. And this is why a lot of regimes, when there was a crisis of authority, either because the dictator died, like in the case of Franco, or there was declining prosperity, or just simple, mass protests and a lack of ability to stop them because the military stopped believing in the authority of the ruler, as in Portugal, because Carnation Revolution ultimately was enabled by the military. And what did they decide to do? Give it to Parliament. They're like, okay, well, fuck it. We're just going to have people vote and decide. And of course you could say in some places this is more managed than others, like in Iraq, after they toppled Saddam, they did have elections, but they were managed. George W. Bush famously said, yeah, we're going to have democracy in Iraq, but we want to make sure our guy wins.
Right.
But it's still it's a really effective way to resolve legitimacy a lot of the time, is just doing that. And that's why he calls this, that because of this long-term trend that we've seen of a progression towards, democracy in some form, he calls it the worldwide liberal revolution. And there's obstacles to this trend. He talks about Islam being a big major challenge to this. And also what you could call illiberal authoritarian capitalist states, such as China, mainly, that are very effective at developing, but without the kind of liberal mechanisms. I would actually say that, honestly, China has even adopted aspects of the liberal revolution. They've kind of pushed back with the Xi Jinping period,
Absolutely.
but they have democracy at local levels where it's just like a safety valve, so people can get out their concerns. And they also, the capitalism, that's a powerful form of megalothymia. China is more of a free market in some ways than the West does in terms of guardrails on business. They can crack down on the business whenever they want, but in terms of starting a business and being able to run it, they really let it go. And part of that is powerful because it allows a lot of the people in society who are ambitious, who might otherwise, if they get a little too pissed off, start a coup d'etat like Robespierre and Lenin. They can go start a business. And that's how you get out your megalothymiac urges,
Yeah, well, and something I would say also, again, about this worldwide liberal revolution that I think is, to bring it back to Hegel and the importance of the return to Hegel that Fukuyama is affecting here. Even if, because I guess I just want to clear this up, because a lot of the way that we're talking about democracy, sort of solving the legitimacy problem, can make it seem maybe as if democracy is sort of like this illusion that just sort of placates the people, but it's not really real. And to some extent, I'm rather sympathetic to that view, but that's not how
managed democracy.
Right,
it
can be, sure. But I think Fukuyama's view is that even when that happens, the ideal of democracy is already operative, and therefore it is manifesting in society, or it will be that you might just put it in really vulgar, straightforward terms. The meme is already out there and it's spreading among the people. The meme of we need to be a liberalized or liberal democratic society. So even if regimes are attempting to placate them by making the pretense of being democratic, even if in fact they're not, the argument would be that in the long term, they're still on that course to, okay, but the meme is there, it's in their heads. They are going to try to realize liberal democracy. They have internalized that as the blueprint for the state at the end of history. And so that's what's going to increasingly be produced and reproduced in the modern world. And he doesn't say that there will not continue to be challenges, as we've brought up. I think it's abundantly clear from everything we've said. He spends so much time addressing the challenges to liberal democracy. Most of the book is him addressing those challenges. I would say the majority of the book is him addressing the counter arguments and giving them a really strong steel man a lot of the time as to why there are serious problems. But in the end, I think the Hegelian orientation that he has is that ultimately there is something driving politics, which is not just simply the desire for material wealth, which we've talked quite a bit about, or material prosperity, something like that, the ability to feed yourself have a decent life, provide for your children, maybe have some economic mobility. He would argue that there is also this desire for recognition, but he puts it in other terms throughout, like the desire for human dignity, the desire to be treated, if not just as an equal, as somebody who has worth, who's recognized as an equal, maybe like not in an economic sense or maybe not in a class sense, but an equal as a human being. And that's really the meme that's taken hold, that liberal democracy is the best system for achieving that mutual recognition, humanity recognizing itself in itself. Use maybe offensively Hegelian language. That this is what the real appeal, I guess, or maybe the more fundamental appeal of liberal democracy is that people perceive it, regardless of their social or cultural context, even though these can all be roadblocks to it, there is a perception that, okay, I am being more fully dignified and recognized as a human being under liberal democracy than I am under Soviet communism or this right-wing dictatorship. And then therefore, even if it's an imperfect managed democracy, they can recognize there could be an even more ideal perfected form in which my human dignity is recognized and noticed. And if you take that theory of history, that where the idea, again, is like the operative force in the driving the human story of history forward, then yeah, like all of these sort of imperfect versions of democracy or apparent facades of democracy, even they are an indication that we're moving in the direction of more fully realizing that ideal. And I do think that that is a powerful argument because, as he points out, it's not just, again, that people might, like, we can imagine situations in which somebody could feel very undignified but be more highly paid, and they could see that as a suboptimal position in society to one in which they're fully dignified but maybe paid a little bit less. And this gets all into the discussion around thymos, which I don't know if we want to get into talking about that, or sort of how he sees thymos.
Yeah, so I realize it is. Originally, I was going to get to thymos and the struggle for recognition in part 3, which is more when he discusses it. But I realized, because we've talked about it, we might as well treat it like a keyword because it comes up, and we should just probably explain the keywords. I just want to say real quick, because sometimes my mind foresees comments that like get a lot of likes due to like jumping at a certain conclusion. When you're talking about like the people feeling more dignified under liberal democracy, a common cope that I see in the Marxist Leninist world and people sympathetic to that, they often love to say, well, polls suggest that people are nostalgic for communism and for the actually existing socialism. I would retort by saying this: why then has there not been a single communist party that's been elected to power, let alone a communist revolution in these countries that are supposedly so nostalgic for communism, right? Why? I mean, because that's the thing about nostalgia. Nostalgia, it's like people in America are across the left and right for all kind of different reasons are nostalgic for the 60s or for the 50s or for the 80s or for the 90s. Doesn't really mean much. It means like, what is your, what are you really willing to fight for politically is a different question, because that's stakes. And clearly not many people in Eastern Europe think that they're, ready to die for communism, especially not that kind, So it's like,
well, nostalgia is
that's
a funny
getting that
thing
out of the
too.
way, yeah.
Nostalgia is a funny thing too, because I think there's something I think everyone develops nostalgia and projects it onto different periods as just if I were to get a little like Freudian here, not something Freud himself necessarily said, but link it to like childhood development.
Yeah,
We're
sure.
all nostalgic because we all remember a time when things were simpler and happier.
Right. Simpler.
And so then, yeah. Even though they never
less
were like
responsibility.
sure, yeah, exactly. And so then like that gets projected onto past ages, sometimes even ages that people have never lived in. There are a lot of conservatives in America who are
Yeah.
nostalgic for the 50s, and they don't actually know what it was like to live in the 50s. They've seen pictures, maybe. They've read books about it in some cases. Otherwise, it might just be a vibe. I don't know. But, you know, you can't actually make that claim as to whether or not, like, if you didn't actually have the subjective experience of living, people, there's a whole debate now going on in some of the circles I run in online about, like, how dark were the Dark Ages?
Yeah,
Weren't
I've
the
seen that.
feudal serfs actually happier?
Mm.
And it's like, you can't really know if a feudal serf was actually happier, because even if we could time travel you back to that period, you would still have this one to compare it with. You, you don't know what it would be like to live in another era for which you had no other comparison, which is always the situation you're in, is that you live in your era and you don't have anything else to compare it to. It's kind of a sidetrack, but yeah,
No,
like
that's a good
I
point.
think communism is it's become an object of nostalgia now because of the fact that, well, there is all this sort of like malaise with the legitimacy of our current system, but it's actually a point in Fukuyama's favor that all we can do is look back to things that were tried in the past. Like, there's no one articulating a new vision of, like, I can't even imagine what it would be, and I think most people can't either. Like, here's a new political vision that bears no, like, it's not just another iteration of capitalism, communism, or fascism. I don't think you can do it, because, or not you specifically, but my challenge to the viewers, like,
Mhm.
has anyone come up with something like that?
Right.
And you might think, oh, well, it's not needed. We already have communism. Or the capitalist realist will say, that's not needed. We already have capitalism. Regardless of what you think of whether it's needed or not, I think Fukuyama is correct that that's the mental framework that we're operating from, and that they can't see beyond. Somebody like Adam Curtis would say that's a problem. We need a new vision.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was very inspired by David Graeber, who surveyed how there's all sorts of different ways of arranging and structuring human life, and maybe we're missing something. Maybe there are new ways that we haven't even thought of yet. But I think, again, the point in Fukuyama's favor is that no one's articulated it yet. And so, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't surprise me at all that people are nostalgic for communism.
That's a crucial point, because when I've been sympathetic to communism and Marxism, it was always under the assumption that the prior attempts had failed. To me, that was not a doubt. To what extent it failed, or to what extent certain things are exaggerated, that's different. But I mean, to me, it was always like kind of evident that it failed, and that any attempt to entertain the idea of communism should be based on rethinking new things. Which is why, to me, I'm not like somebody who thinks, oh, just because whatever failed doesn't mean you should just eat it and like not think of anything alternative to liberal democracy. Well, you should think of it, but you should actually seriously think about it. That requires work. That requires a lot of thought. Not this kind of fantasy that what's funny is that a lot of communist nostalgia is based on a fantasy and propagating that fantasy to fulfill that fantasy. So it's like this idea that, oh, actually back then it wasn't so bad and it was actually pretty decent if only we did a little different things. And fantasy, first off, is, it's fantasy for a reason in a psychoanalytic sense, and that it's thinking about things without the contradictions that you face in reality when actually dealing with that. And that if we can tell people enough, if we can convince people that actually the propaganda is wrong, the bourgeois propaganda is wrong, we can do counter propaganda, then people will realize it actually wasn't so bad and it was pretty good, and maybe we should try it again. And it's like, it's predicated on this changing minds thing. It's really, it's ultimately belief in, like, if you can just lull people essentially into a project, if I'm being very harsh about it. There's nostalgia things. So like, it's funny you mentioned like times being simpler, because I have a really good Ukrainian friend of mine, and his parents are like super anti-communist, but they're liberal and a little sympathetic to socialism. Like socialism for them, and it kind of, they like Bernie Sanders, but they're like very anti-communist. And what's funny is like the father, his dad, who grew up in Ukraine, was saying how actually, yeah, like, life was pretty decent in communist Ukraine. I mean, it was like simpler. And I'm like, oh, like, do you think like you would think Ukraine should be communist now? Oh no. So it's like if he was able to say that with not see, he didn't think
Interesting.
that was contradictory, right? But like because he was saying, well, it's like you had your job given to you. It was easy to find a job. You had school that was free. There's perks. So this is the thing about it. It's like just because there's one, there's a fantasy element about times being simpler. It's also where they grew up, coming of age. But it's also the fact that when people are nostalgic for something, it could be for all kind of reasons. And also this idea of being happy. People were happier back then. This is the thing also that brings us back to thymos and struggle for recognition. Happiness is bullcrap. Happiness is not what drives people to do what they do. This is not the driving force of human nature. So that brings us straight into it. Would you like to maybe explain the struggle for recognition before we get into thymos? Because Fukuyama explains the recognition before thymos. So
yeah, just a brief quote from Nietzsche where he says, "Man does not strive for happiness; only the Englishman does that." Which, to your point earlier, yeah, the struggle for recognition. Well, I mean, he so this is a Kojev reading of Hegel, which Fukuyama is very open about. Thankfully, that's also who I primarily understand Hegel through, in addition to some other sources. But the struggle for recognition is, best understood through like the master and slave dialectic, that Hegel essentially thinks that consciousness, Geist, spirit, that's the primary thing driving history. So again, take yourself away from the just material struggle for resources or something like that, the struggle for the feeding ground, that what happens in this sort of psychological myth that he presents as the starting place of history is that you have two parties, two human beings that enter into a conflict with one another, and basically out of the fear of death, one of them yields to the other, and that person becomes a bondsman, he becomes a slave, the other one becomes a master. And this seems as though the slave has lost out of the arrangement and the master has been elevated because he's recognized as a superior to this other human being. But in fact, the contradiction there is that he's not actually recognized by another human being, because the way that he perceives the slave is as something more like his object. And so he doesn't actually have mutual recognition. He has recognition from an inferior. The other thing that's interesting, Fukuyama brings this up, that it seems as though the master is the ascendant party, but as Hegel will later say, the slave is actually the driving motor of history. And Fukuyama doesn't get into it as much, but the way that I understand it, and that I think is really informative, is that the slave has the experience of being for another, which is actually closer to like a universal recognition of everyone's humanity than the master is. The slave, in other words, his existence is dependent on the master. It's weird because you might say
the master doesn't care for the recognition of the slave because he's not in a position to recognize, whereas the master only would want the recognition of someone above them, and that's the kind of plight they have. I mean, a good example of this in everyday life would be like, for example, I don't know, I'm sure you can relate. Like, I don't know if the audience could relate, but a lot of people would make YouTube videos. If like you get like nice comments, you don't usually care. You only look at negative comments, but you'll really care if someone who's like your peer complimented the video or podcast or whatever you did. Like if there's someone who you respect who does what you do really well and they compliment it, it's like there's a certain like achievement to that in a way where it wouldn't if it's just like someone who is not really in a position to really appreciate it. It's related like this because the struggle of recognition is basically like it's of recognition. It's of dignity, but also of recognition for one's kind of like greatness. It's a sort of like egoic element.
Yeah, well, and this is how he ties it all back to thymos, which in Plato's tripartite self the ideal self for Plato is ruled by reason. Reason is ruling the impulses, the drives, the passions, whatever you want to call them. But mediating between them, you might say, is thymos, which the way Plato describes it is that he says that if reason is properly ruling, it will like rally the thymos to keep the impulses in check. But really the term means spirit, but it's in the sense of like spiritedness. Like when we say that's the spirit. Fukuyama seems to almost treat it as being in the same, being almost akin to like Nietzsche's will to power, which I have some comments on that because I think that's actually very interesting the way he treats this. But it ties in with the struggle for recognition because he essentially says that the master he was acting out of thymos. That the reason why recognition is this driving motor of history is that what we could describe thymos as spirit is that desire to be recognized. And the reason why in the master-slave dialectic, Hegel says that it eventually concludes in the state at the end of history where all are mutually recognized is because that's the way that we overcome that contradiction of the master not receiving the full recognition of an equal. That's why it's a dissatisfactory relationship to the master. And this proceeds, if you want to look at it in material terms, you could say it proceeds through a series of imperfect relationships of direct bondage, and then you have like sort of feudal serfs and lords, and then in the communist accounting of things, then you have like capitalist exploitation and the wage slave, and then that eventually they'll be fully recognized like once we have a communist system. Fukuyama thinks it is the liberal system because even if, and he gets into this in the later chapters, even if there's like economic inequality, there's still, again, the basic recognition of your rights and dignities as, say, in America, as a citizen of the United States, you have those rights allotted to you, regardless of whether or not you're not of a certain social class or a certain race or certain ethnicity or something like that. That it's actually not necessary. It's another way in which he is like, he's doing dialectics in a more purely Hegelian way and not a Marxist way, because I think Hegel had a very similar conception that it wasn't necessarily that you would create this perfect equality on earth, in like the communist sense of the term equality, but rather that the important thing was a transformation again of the consciousness or of the mind, of seeing that I'm another for others and they are others, but they are human beings for me. We are all for each other. We all recognize each other within this state at the end of history, something like that. But, thymos plays into it because, again, he uses it in the sense of dignity, something like that. Or it could also refer to, like the classic example in Plato is anger. That like the guardians are like the thymotic class who they express their anger by like safeguarding the republic, something like that. But he sort of points out, he uses the term indignation. Like when we talk of righteous indignation, the fact that your dignity has been affronted. So he's not just talking about all emotions. He's not just talking about dignity. He's talking about like a cluster of a series of emotions that have to do with how you're recognized by others.
That's, well, the perfect, when you say righteous indignation, what comes to mind is the struggle for civil rights. And, a common argument, right, that the Confederates or people, long after the Confederacy, when there was segregation in the South, would often make is, well, black people here are actually wealthier than most of all blacks in Africa. What are you complaining about? But the struggle wasn't about material conditions for black people. This was about a struggle for basic dignity. It's that, it's sure you can be materially more abundant than someone in Africa, but if you're in America and you live with whites, but you're denied the fundamental same rights, right, as people who are otherwise also human, just have different skin color. There's something like deeply undignifying about that, and it's for this reason, right, where some of the most iconic things that sort of like trigger a lot of mass resistance were stuff like the Rosa Parks incident, where it's like you're being told to sit in a place that you don't want to be sitting just because you're a different skin color. It's like deeply undignifying. I mean, it's like it's like this kind of part of the reason why, right, like there's this urge in the first place is precisely because blacks and whites are living together, but under a certain level of prosperity compared to the world. But denied this right, there's a urge for basic dignity, and that's the struggle for recognition. It's in some ways you could say it's related to the struggle people have for status, right? You could say status is like a superficial egoic urge, but it's not all not all these urges are superficial, and egoic is not necessarily like, I want to be better than others. That's where you get into megalothymia. That's a different urge. Isothymia is this urge to be more like others. This is like for Fukuyama, to recap, dignity, the battle for dignity, not material well-being, is what drives history. It's people wanting dignity. In fact, a big problem you had actually is a lot of aristocrats who never had satiable desires. They had these insatiable desires to have exert their pride and to have more achievement. They would often exercise this by going to war, right? And part of the liberal project, as he writes about, was to contain this impulse of pride through institutions at the level of government and through a market-based system where people, could get that out by just getting some money or expressing oneself in some ways. It's not always. I should not buy into this idea, actually, that we shouldn't buy into this idea that like the drive, like market society is capitalism. That's also another thing I find a bit of a critique is what I prefer about classical Marxists is they actually distinguish bourgeois society from capitalism. So like this early stage of like, being able to be a independent producer or like a farmer, own your own land, own your own shop. It's not all about getting rich, but there's a certain pride in that, right? And it does satiate your pride. Whereas if this impulse of pride is relegated to aristocrats and slaves, you got or peasants, you get permanent struggle, right, between the peasants and the slaves, serfs, people who are subordinate to a master. You get, as Hegel thought, a kind of class struggle, which will result in a more equal society where you have more equal recognition. But also the other thing about that is that if the powerful, like an aristocratic power, has this urge for recognition, they'll get it out through megalothymia ways that involve usually war. Whereas under like a market-based system, capitalism, you can get out your urge to be better than others through just making more money or inventing the next thing or starting a podcast or being a professor. I mean, this is a good example, right? Publishing books. Nietzsche famously wrote or something about like, why do philosophers not have kids or something? Was it that
I think, well, he does talk about married philosopher belongs in comedy. Most of them don't have a family life. You might be thinking of the quote where he says that writing symphonies is another way of having children.
Yes. Yeah. Basically creating art or creating, things like that are from you. It's like a way to in some ways it's extending your ego into the universe in a way that like having a kid would, but it's like, it's not, that's obviously different, but you get the gist. This is like a fundamental urge of humans. And if you deny that urge too much, it gets expressed in all kind of other ways.
Well, and I think, so this is a really interesting thing about what Fukuyama is doing, because when he goes back to sort of the ideological origins of liberalism, he does find some precedent for what he is arguing, this like Hegelian, Kojevian view, in, for example, Thomas Hobbes, where Hobbes Hobbes refers to like man's pride and vanity as one of the reasons why the state of nature, I mean, Hobbes, I don't believe uses the term state of nature. He calls it the state of war, but oftentimes we just refer to it as
the state of nature is a state of war.
Right. But he refers to basically, man's pride and vanity as being the reason why mankind will fight one another. And that the way that you curtail that is you have to suppress it. It's basically Fukuyama's reading of Hobbes is he perceives this megalothymiac drive in human beings, that everyone has thymos and it can express itself in this urge to dominate. And so therefore you have to suppress it with the Leviathan. And that this people can popularly consent to this. Again, the other thing about Hobbes that's very interesting is like he has this idea of legitimacy in his work. That's not through popular democracy, but it's the same idea that like the people aren't revolting. They're basically accepting the situation because they know it's to their interest when people are not expressing their thymotic impulses through war.
Social contract. You voluntarily sacrifice your freedom for security, right?
Right. But the interesting thing is that as he brings up, when you get to the liberalism of Locke, which is far more influential on, say, the founding fathers of America, they tend to think of the basis on which liberalism is established as having more to do with like the right to accumulate and the right to endlessly, like they're thinking of it more in terms of your ability to satisfy desires, not necessarily the thymotic aspect of the self, but to like rationally calculate to in order to satisfy your material needs. One of the things he says is that, you know, the pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson puts it, is basically indistinguishable from Locke's understanding that within the free society, we'll be able to accumulate as much property as we want. That property is, sorry, go on.
That's crucial, actually, because peace, what are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property is Locke, and that's kind of this ability. It represents this ability for people to get out their urge to do something, to have a certain freedom. Jefferson replaces property with happiness when writing the Declaration of Independence, because for Jefferson, property shouldn't be construed as the goal in itself. It should just be a means to that. Right. So like property for Jefferson, as for a lot of the founders, was just a means of independence. That's what it was. It gave people the power to be real citizens. Hence why you had still at this point, like voter, you had property qualifications, because in America, that didn't seem, in democratic America, that didn't seem like a bad idea, given that most people, a lot of people, actually, like a great deal of the percentage of the adult male population could own property. In England, you had voting and you had property qualifications, but that was roughly like it was 4 to 6% of the population, and then extended to 11, and then extended to more over time, but it was much more restrictive.
Yeah. Well, and he brings that up too as like perhaps a like fortuitous development that, how does he put it? The ideas of democracy, or like the ideas of liberty, were developed among that limited group before democracy spread to the entire society.
Right, exactly.
That actually could have had a well, because that, I think he, again, from Fukuyama's standpoint, it's very important that we understand liberty as this central value, and so you want to really inculcate that in your voting base as that outwardly expands. But it is interesting, that he sees essentially it's there in Hobbes, and it's sort of like in the background. There's like occasional like breaches into consciousness of the need for like satisfaction of thymos. But that, largely speaking, I think he thinks with the English tradition going through Locke, they were far more concerned with like the proof of liberalism, in so many words, for them was like the Adam Smith argument, the wealth of nations. This is going to make us wealthier. This is going to allow us to accrue more property. This is going to allow us to satisfy all of our desires. And it's the most rational system for doing that. So part of why what Fukuyama is doing is so important, I think, in trying to rediscover that element in Hobbes, and then also bring Hegel into the liberal democratic project, is because precisely because he identifies that as the main weak point from criticisms coming from Nietzsche and others, or actually from the left as well, because the criticism on both sides, he would say, again, is like on a fundamental level, not material. in the sense that the criticism from Nietzsche is that the system suppresses megalothymia. The criticism from the left would be there's not as much opportunity for isothymia, for equal recognition, because of the alienation in the system caused by the inequalities and all of these things. But that ultimately thymos is at the center of the main challenges that are going to come to the system. And so I think what he's trying to do is actually, it's really interesting from, like, if you think about like Leo Strauss and his argument that liberal democracy doesn't have like a really good narrative or story to bolster it against these challenges. In a way, you can see what Fukuyama is trying to do on a meta level is provide that story of like, no, we are part of this grand project of history that's eventually going to provide dignity to all the human race, all of the human race. Like, liberal democracy isn't just accumulation of wealth and resources. It's the state at the end of history that Hegel wrote about. And so people, again, can laugh at that all they want. But I think what he's doing is actually, like, if you're a Straussian, you might think that that's like a really important thing for liberal democracy to have on its side, is a compelling narrative that's not strictly material about like how it's beneficial to the spirit, something like that.
That's such a good insight, and that's actually that's actually the esoteric doctrine of this book. So
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
it's not so esoteric, but it's esoteric in the sense that Fukuyama, it's esoteric because he doesn't mention Leo Strauss directly in any of this, really. I mean, he does briefly, but it's not like he doesn't make it very clear that he's borrowing a lot of things from Strauss. So Fukuyama was a student of Alan Bloom, who's a Straussian, and Alan Bloom was one of Strauss's best students. Alan Bloom's also a thinker people should read. Very interesting. This is kind of like the Straussian tree. It is interesting. I'll just say that there's God.
sorry, that opened up a whole can of worms, didn't it? Yeah,
It did because, well, put me on all these thinkers. What was my mentor, Asad Haider, and he was fascinated with Ellen Badiou because he thinks Badiou is trying to do this for communism. What basically Strauss is doing for liberal democracy, Badiou is trying to do that actually for communism. But yeah, to go back to some of the things there on the thymos and whatnot. So, we're talking about. So if I were to define the difference between like modernity and before modernity in the most simple way possible, it would be that basically what characterizes modernity is an attempt, a move towards civility. And what do we mean by that? When we think of civilized, right? It's a word that now today we think is just like a Eurocentric dog whistle or something. No. Civilized just usually means it's like people getting out their human impulses without killing each other, more or less, without violence. It's at the core of the liberal project, and the project towards civility is against violence. It's why, the biggest progenitor of liberal ideology, England, is known for being very polite. It's not a coincidence. People often move to Canada, where I'm from, which is an extension of Britain, largely because it's marked by it's a nation marked by peace, order, and good government. This is a core to its project. So the liberal project and the more broadly the modernist project is touring towards civilizing society, and that entails containing some of these most destructive and creative human urges by channeling them, which include thymos, which Plato wrote about. These are old things, but people before modernity had a tragic view of history. People often have you could call that pre-enlightenment or anti-enlightenment view. It's often they believe in what's called the tragic view of history, which is that there's these fundamental human impulses that cause humans to do things that are somewhat inevitable, somewhat unavoidable, and there's going to be tragedies, people's lives getting taken. You're going to have cycles of civilizational decline. due to bad human impulses and tendencies to do certain things over and over and again. People who have that view have the tragic view. The modern view is to contain these and channel them in a way in which people can like progress continually. That's where you get like progressivism. Modern progressivism as an ideology is something separate, but I mean more so this idea of history progressing as opposed to the tragic view, which is cyclical.
Right. I would say
I
like
think we should,
I tend to use like developmental versus cyclical because it could be progress, or like Nietzsche would say, for example, it could well take the form of a degeneration, but it would still be a logic of development, even if it degenerates. Or like you might look at like Evolin's, like the traditionalists. They basically think
yeah,
all
that
of,
was gonna say that's the tragic view. They take the tragic view.
well, I was going to say, but they are fundamentally different from somebody like, say, Spengler, who thinks that there's like
Very much
this
the tragic view.
constant.
Yeah.
Well, so but they're different though, because
Yeah.
Spengler would say there's this repeating cycle. Evola would say there was like one original, there was like a literal golden age, and it's all been downhill from there, and it's going to get worse. So it's not actually cyclical.
Right.
It's still developmental. It's just bad. It's just bad. It's in the wrong direction.
Right,
It's
bad.
not
See,
progress. Yeah.
and Evola is, thinks that's why you need like a revolt against the modern world. And in many ways, I recently read the Unabomber manifesto by Ted Kaczynski, which it's a whole other rabbit hole. But I mean, that is also a weird, like, I
Yeah.
would say, people say whether he's left wing or not. I actually say he was, and that's not a good thing.
He's
For
like left wing in like a Rousseauian sense, I guess.
who's the origin of left wing thought, many say.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's like, that's the thing about it. Funny, we should talk about that some other time, because that's a fascinating thing. Like, what a disaster that book is. It's the most well articulated work of insanity ever, in terms of there's good points, but it's also very insane. But ultimately, look, you get this attempt to you do believe that history is like, you accept that view of progress. That's the thing about Evola. Evola seemed to be more pessimistic about whether you could actually reverse that, but ultimately thought people should try. Ted Kaczynski also wanted to reverse progress, but they still buy into that idea of like history unfolding in this linear way. It's just, we want to stop it somehow, because it's
Right.
getting bad. Spengler, takes the tragic view. Like, Spengler, in many ways, why he's so important is because he was writing The Decline of the West right during, and like put it out, I think, right when World War I was happening. So it did look like the decline of the West was very much happening. So it's part of why Fukuyama at the very beginning talks about like our pessimism is the reason why people didn't believe in the worldwide liberal revolution is because of events like the First World War and the Second World War. So there's
There's
that.
also a great quote from Schopenhauer where he says, "Whoever lives through 2 or 3 generations in history is like a man who sits for some time at a magician's booth at a fair and sees the same trick performed 2 or 3 times. It loses all its magic and fails to deceive, and you realize it's just the same tricks over and over again." So Schopenhauer also has like a completely tragic view of history, in that he literally thinks, I think what you find is the commonality with a lot of these views, the tragic view. There's usually some kind of religious element. And it's also true with like the negative developmental historical view.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's no future in history, there's no future for the human race worth aiming towards, that would be necessarily very disempowering. So they're usually seeking for something like else, like asceticism, or like looking within. There's like something else that they're looking for, right? That other than progress being attained in history. And that's why, traditionally it is like more materialist views that have the progressive view of history, because the most noticeable improvement in the course of history, and Fukuyama brings this up, is technology. And even when you can say that we're like backsliding ideologically from the liberal end of history, because technology can obviously be used by regimes that don't hold those beliefs, and it can be used very effectively by them. It's nevertheless, technology in its development's inseparable from like the liberalization of the markets and the industrial era. And it's almost impossible to claim that technology has not improved in terms of, again, that like satisfaction of desires, that lower third of Plato's tripartite self. Like it's almost impossible to say that we have, in terms, if we were just looking at that we have it worse off than people did like in the Middle Ages. That's just insane. Like you're not going to, if you break your leg, you're not going to die of like some infection, in all likelihood. If you need like cheap and easy to acquire calories, you can get them more easily than people ever have been able to. So on that level, at least, the progress seems almost like undeniable. So it has to be like the challenge has to come on the level of like spirit, like that there has to be something about like modernity that is curtailing the spirit in some way, which again Fukuyama is aware of. But I think that's why there's like tragic views of history. Like for Schopenhauer, he's like, it's all asceticism. I should just be trying to like negate my will and transcend this world. So if you're interested in transcending the world, you don't really care about technological progress or anything like that. But yeah.
So you actually jumped to one of the next things I was going to talk about, but I do want to, which is the technology component. But I want to break up Fukuyama's theory into the materialist component and the idealist component, which go together. And that technological thing you alluded to is a big part of the materialist component of Fukuyama's theory of history. But to get at the idealist first, because I feel like we should complete that a bit more, so the listeners understand it. Now, also, when you were talking about the decline, I mean, a big person he's responding to actually implicitly is James Burnham. James Burnham's another kind of neocon type who does think the West is declining. He's responding in the 60s. Well, he actually was writing from the 40s to the 60s, but he's seeing the waves of decolonization and stuff. And he sees like, in a real decline of the West. He also sees like the racial chaos going on. He just takes a much more conservative position. He's well dead before Fukuyama starts writing, so it's like he's a man before. But Fukuyama, when he's talking about pessimism, he's also referring to James Burnham's book, The Suicide of the West, which is a good book. I actually recommend it. It is a very good book. There's some ways in which what he says about liberalism has some truth to what he says about liberals. I'll say that about the guilt.
Well, and really, really briefly, the other thing about Burnham in the Managerial Revolution, he makes it clear he doesn't really see there being too much of a distinction between communism, New Deal democracy, and fascism, in terms of they all represent a bureaucratic administrative state taking over. And so I see Fukuyama opposing Burnham on that level as well, because he would say, no, there is like a qualitative difference on the level of the ideal, right?
Well, yeah, but also like Burnham is a neocon, and a lot of neocons, a lot of people don't know this, come out of being former pro-Roosevelt people, including Reagan himself. So like Reagan was pro-Roosevelt, was actually Democrat, considered too left for the Democratic Party. James Burnham was a Trotskyist. A lot of people who were pro-Roosevelt came to see the welfare state that was built up as extending the kind of managerial revolution and making America more like embodying the problems they started to see in the Soviet Union and in fascism. And they kind of turned against that. That's kind of like why, you got Reagan saying we need welfare to help the needy, not the greedy, and all this. Like, I'm just saying, folks like this didn't emerge out of nowhere, like this sort of thinking. It kind of didn't emerge out of some like far right. And a lot of them was, former people who supported the left's favorite president, Roosevelt. But back to this history. So yeah, like Fukuyama thinks that these people before are way too pessimistic because they weren't looking at the broader view. They were too myopic. And Fukuyama, who takes a very broad view of history, sees Christianity as something that unleashed something fundamental that developed into liberalism, and that from liberalism developed into liberal democracy over a gradual long period. With Christianity, what's important is Christianity is very important to the struggle of recognition. And, this is not necessarily something that's particularly that unique to Fukuyama, given that it's in Hegel himself. For Hegel, part of what Christianity did is that it, unlike almost any doctrine before, said that all people of all races are equal under God. People, that's taken for granted today. Like that, this idea was very radical. In Hinduism, that is not the case. There are some people in Hinduism who are just ordained to be inferior to others. There's castes. Even in Buddhism, people don't want to look at it. Buddhism has got reinterpreted over time, but in terms of what Buddha himself thought, Buddha didn't think women could get enlightenment. So,
Sure.
the
Well,
idea of
it's a multi-lifetime project, Tony.
Of course. So
if you're a woman, you just got to work hard and get reincarnated as a man. Try again next time.
That's funny. But yeah, and then also some people leftists love to say, okay, like, what about all these tribal indigenous societies and religions that were egalitarian? Yeah, amongst each other. It's a big difference. Like, there's common for many local groups of the same ethnicity to be egalitarian internally, but then to enslave other groups, right? Christianity is very powerful in having that unleashing that idea of equality. You could say wasn't obeyed in practice, given that, Christians enslaved people, of course, right? The Spanish Empire enslaved people. In fact, invented the category of blackness practically as a legal category to give an excuse to enslave people after blacks converted to Christianity. Fun fact. So it's like, nonetheless, though, this unleashed the struggle for recognition in a way that, like, it actually was kind of inconceivable for the slave to strive for recognition and equality to the master, in which their struggle for recognition, once you no longer have slavery, will still exist, but it won't be between master and slave. So, like, when Hegel thinks the struggle for recognition would still exist after the abolition of slavery, it just wouldn't characterize this framework that drives history itself. So for Hegel, like, the end of history does, happen in a regime that can contain these conflicts. Liberalism, extends this idea of equality through a scientific basis. Like Hobbes is writing during the scientific revolution. With the scientific revolution, you start to, like, you're able to do stuff that you just couldn't do before. You can understand matter. There's the Copernican revolution where now we realize how the Earth actually is. You don't have people really didn't understand the world before. People would, like, look around and it was up to the imagination as to how things happen, why the sky is the way it is, why water is the way it is. How else you don't know. When you start to have a scientific revolution, part of why that kicks off is because of war. So, like, part of why other countries start adopting, the scientific innovations of other countries is because it gives them an advantage in war. That's the incentive for it. And that's why progress for Fukuyama is fundamentally forward, because you can't reverse technology, because once one country adopts that technology, other countries will be like, hey, we should adopt it too, or else we're going to get slaughtered. And then you get countries adopting it as much as they can. The thing is, though, is that created war being way more deadly once you get, the invention of gunpowder and cannons and all kind of stuff, bombs. And so, like, liberalism emerges as wars get more deadly, partially as a way to pacify this. So with Hobbes, he's literally writing during the English Civil War. And that's why he can only think of, like, the sovereign dictatorship, monarchy, right? Like a monarchy, but under the people's consent. He also, though, basically pioneers the idea of equality into modern political theory. Even Machiavelli didn't believe in fundamental equality. Machiavelli believed that you should have class struggle where the masses, the common people, get democratic power to check the powerful, the grande. But he still thought that there was a grande and a people, and the common people. for Hobbes, he still believes in classes, but that there's no biological difference between people. Like that's why Hobbes's idea of equality, which is like he does say quite literally in the Leviathan. I mean, if you like at the physical level, like humans are not really unequal. Some might be bigger than others, some might be smarter than others. But at their core, we're the same species.
Right.
That
At the end of
unleashes
the day, doesn't he use the
yeah.
example? It's like I can't remember the specific example he uses, but it's like the smartest, most athletic, most like witty and just creative person could just be easily killed by somebody else with like a firearm.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
by like the dumbest person alive. So it's
Right.
basically like the fundamental, I mean, you could even say like the existential dimensions of what it means to be human bind us in a really like serious way. Like that it is actually not as relevant that you're smarter or of a different social class or stronger physically or something like that at the end of the day for Hobbes. Which is, yeah, it's a position Hobbes takes that is rarely discussed. It's always the brutal vision of mankind given by Hobbes and the sunshine and rainbows given by Rousseau. When in fact that doesn't describe either one of them and their view of human nature.
Yeah, and like a big thing underpinning all of this is war, right? Because there's a technological advantage, but also as you get technological advantage, you get the consolidation of modern nation states where people can occupy spaces in a way that they couldn't before. You also get the printing press. You get also gradually, this is a little more of a previous development, but like the development of universities and bureaucracies, right, to keep track of things. You get gradually the modern nation state. The modern nation state has, as nation states, then there's other nation states that rival each other. They start to get an incentive to get a bigger military. In England, one thing they figure out with, and this is part of the pretext of it's complicated, but the English Civil War. But one of the revolutionary things that Oliver Cromwell does in the English Civil War is he creates the new model army, which is an army that's not based on aristocracy. Because, mind you, a lot of societies before, their hierarchy was based on literally only some people being allowed to fight in the military. And that was their basis of power. Well, yeah, we got the guns and the horses. We can just kill you and nothing you can do. When you get regular people, or at least non-noble people, enter the military, now they have a basis of power that like just humanity did not before. It's just massive, like in terms of what that can do. Mind you, I should say that Machiavelli had proposed this thing way before with the civilian militia, but elites were resistant to common people being involved in the military because, yeah, if they're out, then the guns are in the hands of the powerful. Duh, they can squeeze them. Thing about the new model army, I also want to say that there's like aspects of this in the past too. Like Greek democracy was held together by the fact that it was the people who went to war who decided to make it a democracy. There's also that,
right?
The pretext of
or
democracy.
the Roman plebeians and the fact that
Yeah.
it wasn't just like free entry. You kind of had to buy your own equipment, but
Yeah,
meritocratically, quote unquote, if you were like a small holder, you could conceivably, that was like a path to basically prosperity in a way. Like you can go plunder on these campaigns, you'll get a stipend for life when you're done. It was like there was a path for the average person into the military. And in fact, a lot of the crisis in the late Republic was the fact that people couldn't afford to join the military anymore. Like because of the economic situation, or there were just less, like they hollowed out the plebeian middle class. And so they started to rely more on foreign auxiliaries. But yeah, like there is a relationship, I think, between what would you say, like the level of democracy in your society and traditions of people like everyone contributing to military service in some way.
Yeah. I had another podcast on this that I recorded with Harper O'Connor, but I didn't release it yet.
Mm.
So it's actually called The Case for Service.
Mm. Yeah, would you like to know more? The Starship Troopers. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because it's like today with like leftists, it's funny. It's actually like, the idea seems crazy. Like, oh, you would want people to make service. No, it's their freedom to not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the
okay.
original
You want a
book.
more democratic? Look at all the most democratic countries that exist now. Like, they all have military service. Like Switzerland,
Yeah.
that's like the most democratic country. It does not go to war because if you have the regular population that's now has to actually potentially fight in the war, they're going to probably be more resistant to it, which is why you had more resistance against Vietnam when there was conscription than you do to like the Iraq war.
True. Yeah.
That's a whole other story.
Yeah. Yeah, and Switzerland's an interesting case because everything about that society is very remarkable, but that's one of the things that you keep your gun when you are done with military service. So like they have more, I think Switzerland more accurately like reflects the Platonic ideal of like a people's militia than even America does. I mean, because even though we conceivably have more access to more and crazier types of firearms than they do, everyone there is trained and keeps their rifle and is basically they have their contingency plans in case the country's ever invaded, where they'll blow the entrances to the tunnels and the people will retreat for a guerrilla war in the mountains. It's like it's one of the most peaceful countries and, like, as you say, one of the most democratic on earth, but the way that they're like secure in that is by being like armed and ready for conflict.
And part of that social trust. I mean, America has less social trust, and there's Fukuyama writes, right, that the paradox of liberalism and capitalism is that the forces that require it to be founded and work get undermined by liberalism and capitalism. So, like, some level of social trust, such as shared national identity or shared ethnic identity, but he's really emphasizes the national because we have to remember that, like, the French Revolution, while being a liberal revolution, is also a nationalist revolution. It basically creates the modern nation of France. It basically makes French the dominant language that everyone has to learn in schools. You get standardized schooling. These are not things that, before people in their local areas would speak different languages. So, it's no. We've got to remember nationalism is very bound up into the democratic project. Ethno-nationalism is a little bit more in the modern age. Later on is a little bit different, obviously, but it's like there's a component to that, and also values that were that bounded tight communities together, and established work ethics and sacrificial ethics. These are like pre-liberal values, such as, for example, in the West, that would be largely Christian values. In the East, they still have these values more probably, which is like Confucianism in China, Shintoism in Japan, Buddhism, right? Like very like austere values that get people to work hard, have children, obey the society to some extent. In America, the paradox is you have an undermining of that because liberalism, on the one hand, undermines these values through its relativism. So when liberalism chooses to not like impose any values and the freedom for everyone to practice whatever, it ultimately, essentially, I don't want to sound like an arch conservative here, but I mean, it allows for the degeneration of those values. It quite literally does, in the sense that if one is taking a back seat and takes a relative view and doesn't promote an idea of the good, well, it's just going to be a really up to some extent the market, and the market is people.
Well,
So
I
there's
mean,
also that the capitalist market also disintegrates these values through the fact that, like, to do well in capitalism as capitalism wants individualism and it wants a consumer society. And if you want that, that is kind of like pretty much in conflict with like religious or traditionalist values, right? But the paradox is like the values kind of are needed to some extent to like keep the whole thing running, but it
It's
undermines it.
one of the
So
best points that he makes is that when he talks about the Protestant work ethic and like its history in America, because of the fact that it makes work a good in and of itself, independent of accumulation. And he does say that, like, really a lot of work, he talks about the thymotic origins of work, or the thymotic like driver behind work. A lot of the most successful people, or the most successful businessmen, you can't really explain their behavior just solely from like capital accumulation, because beyond a certain point, you can't, like, there's only so many mansions you can buy and cars you can drive. Like, you can't even enjoy all the stuff you've accumulated. So, like, beyond a certain point, it's not even, you're not even adding to your overall material well-being. The only way you can really explain it is through this like thymotic urge to work. But he basically says that the Protestant work ethic, it was like a kind of source of pride that you take in your calling. He compares it to the Japanese salaryman who's working longer hours for, like, you know, he might be doing really well in his company, but in spite of whatever wealth he acquires, he can't ever enjoy it because the hours he works are so long. So it's like, what are we really doing here? And his argument is essentially like, it's another self-respect thing. It's another dignity thing. It's another way of essentially,
it's for the community.
right, the community, but also like in the Protestant work ethic sense, he talks about there's like a Calvinist tradition. I think you can go back further to like the Puritans, in terms of like, I'm essentially doing this for God in so many words. I mean, it's not in Fukuyama's book. There's a great
It's the right thing to do.
there's a great quote from Luther. I believe it's Luther, or it might have been Calvin himself. I can't remember. It's in Foucault's Madness and Civilization, where it's basically an old theologian talking about how the reason why we work is not because it feeds us. The reason why we work is because God has ordained that we work while we're in this existence as part of the fall from grace. And so people who quote scripture saying like, oh, consider the lilies of the field, they toil not, God will take care of me. His argument is essentially like, no, that's like a heresy to think that way, because you're using that logic to get out of working. So there's like, anyway, one of the best points Fukuyama makes is that, I believe the way he puts it is that liberal societies depend on pre-liberal sentiments and values, including the Protestant work ethic. So this was pre-existing, and it's like, to use like a cynical way of like almost like parasitizing off of it, you could say. Modern liberal individualism like is drawing its sort of strength from like the vestiges of this Protestant work ethic. But that is, again, as you point out, its main problem, because as you become increasingly relativistic and individualistic and atomized, fewer people believe in such things. And he brings up the example of Pascal, where one writer was sort of lamenting the fact that Pascal wasted his genius and his talents on theology, and that essentially, and he quotes from Zarathustra, the section on the last man, where they say, formerly all the world was insane. Basically, like, we look at somebody like Pascal today and we're like, wow, you were like inventing a calculator when in the 1600s and proving Euclid's theorems independently. Like, you could have done all of these great things for productive labor, for like improving the conditions of satisfying our desires, but instead you did this thymotic thing. And that's basically like, that's the misunderstanding that is probably the most dangerous thing for liberalism, I would think, from Fukuyama's perspective, is not comprehending that the thymotic outlet is needed, and looking at Pascal as somebody who's just like crazy. It is funny because he's talking about it in the context of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche also said that Christianity ruined Pascal. It was for different reasons. It wasn't because he thought he should have done something more productive with his life. It was more that, he was promoting these otherworldly values and everything. But I did find that to be a funny irony because Nietzsche also kind of says Pascal was insane. He says the greatest crime on Christianity's conscience for 2,000 years is what it did to Pascal. So, yeah. But anyway, the biggest danger to liberalism is probably the misunderstanding that what gets people to be productive is precisely not out of the desire to simply accumulate wealth or satisfy material needs, that it is actually something pre-liberal. Another thing he says is that was really interesting was that it was good that we had the third world during sort of like the 20th century for people from the post-historical world to go to the historical world. He brings up an example of this one figure who like died fighting the Japanese in Burma, and talks about how essentially like almost the ability to go and be an adventurer in a foreign conflict or any number of things. The fact that there's like still a historical world there is very useful as a safety valve for all the people with megalothymiac impulses here in the post-historical world. But that raises another problem, right? Because if you enter a fully post-historical state, then presumably you won't have that safety valve anymore.
Righty. So yeah, we're pretty deep into this conversation, and I really congratulate people who've stuck around to listen to it all. I think you'll get a lot of value from it. In the back room, we're going to continue the second half of this discussion. We're going to continue talking about it because it's fun and it's a big book and there's a lot of material to cover. Basically, you can get access to it on Patreon by becoming a patron. You get access to all of the second half of every single episode that I do. It's all on Patreon. It's the second half of the show is there, called The Back Room. And it's how the show stays afloat. It's how I maintain independence from the sponsors and to a large extent, as I hope will continue, from audience capture from my main channel. Because by having a backroom audience that is very open to ideas of all sorts and can think very critically, I won't have to appease a big audience that my main channel is on, which my main channel I could not cover ideas as diverse due to the nature of views and algorithms. And also, you should at this point be subscribed to Essential Salts, like one of the best podcasts when it comes to theories, ideas.
Thank you. I agree. Subscribe to Essential Salts.
If you like this idiosyncratic stuff, definitely check it out. I'm sure you already have if you've listened this far, and see you there.
Yes, I very much like Tony's backroom model. I fully approve.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life?